Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was upon a particularly wild evening in the autumn of 1897 that I found myself seated by the hearth at 221B Baker Street, a battered medical journal resting upon my knee and a half-forgotten pipe smouldering at my elbow. The wind, rising from the east, howled against the window panes with such ferocity that I could scarcely hear the steady bubble of Holmes's latest chemical experiment from across the room. My friend, as was often his wont during periods of enforced inactivity, had thrown himself into some obscure inquiry concerning the solubility of South American resins, the pungent fumes of which mingled with the scent of damp tobacco and the distant tang of London rain. Holmes, his lean frame silhouetted against the lamplight, bent over his retorts with an air of grim absorption. His brow, furrowed in concentration, bespoke a mind desperate for stimulation. Any case, however trivial, would have been preferable to this scientific drudgery. It was precisely at this moment, as if summoned by fate itself, that our knocker sounded sharply, twice in quick succession, heralding the arrival of one who, judging by the urgency of his knock, carried some weighty burden upon his soul. Holmes straightened at once, his keen ear attuned to the nuances of that desperate summons. "A visitor, Watson," he murmured, already reaching for his dressing gown, "and one in considerable distress. If my ears do not deceive me, pray answer the door before Mrs. Hudson is roused unnecessarily." I obeyed, descending the short flight of stairs to find a man in his early 40s standing upon our threshold. His clothes, though of good quality, were rumpled and rain-splashed, and his hat, clutched between trembling fingers, bore the unmistakable marks of long and anxious handling. His face, pale, pinched, and bearing the gauntness of recent sleeplessness, looked up at me with the desperate expression I had seen only in men whose professional or personal lives hung by the slenderest of threads. "Doctor Watson," he asked, his voice hoarse, "is Mr. Holmes within? I must see him, at once, if you please. I have come upon a matter of the gravest urgency." I ushered him inside, relieved him of his sodden coat, and led him to the sitting-room, where Holmes had already taken his accustomed place, fingers steepled, eyes half-closed, the very picture of expectant patience. "Your name, sir?" Holmes asked, with the soft authority that always seemed to put clients at ease. "Edmund Statham," the man replied, sinking into the chair opposite. "I am a barrister, Mr. Holmes, and I fear I am come to place the life of an innocent woman in your hands." Holmes inclined his head slightly, his sharp gaze sweeping over our visitor with the same quiet intensity I had witnessed so many times before. "Pray proceed, Mr. Statham," he said. "Tell us who this woman is, and what charge has been laid against her." Statham drew from his breast pocket a crumpled letter, its edges blotched with water, ink, and what appeared at first glance to be dried blood. "The lady in question," he said, "is my client, Miss Clara Winslow. Until recently, she served as a companion to Sir Hubert Forley, a retired colonel of the Indian Army. Sir Hubert was found dead in his study 3 nights ago, poisoned, the police say, and Miss Winslow has been charged with the crime." Holmes's fingers twitched slightly at the mention of poison, but he remained silent, his expression unreadable. "Miss Winslow admits to having discovered the body," Statham continued, "but she swears upon her very soul that she had no hand in his death. There is, however, a curious matter which the police have dismissed as irrelevant, a letter delivered to Miss Winslow on the very day of Sir Hubert's death." He held up the crumpled sheet. It was an anonymous warning, urging her to leave the house before sundown. It stated, explicitly, that if she remained beyond that hour, Sir Hubert would surely die. Holmes extended his hand, taking the letter with his characteristic delicacy. I saw at once that something in the paper arrested his attention. "Curious ink," he murmured, "and a clumsy attempt to disguise the handwriting, a contradiction in itself. And this smear here, Watson, do you observe the faint brown tint at the edge?" "Rust," I suggested. "Not rust," he said softly. "This, my dear Watson, is a trace of a particular ink manufactured only in certain South American ports. A detail of no small significance, I dare say." Holmes unfolded the letter with care, smoothing it against his knee. The paper was of a coarse, common variety, the sort used for tradesmen's invoices, and its edges had been roughly torn. Across its surface, the message had been written in a cramped, uneven hand, as though the author had been at pains to obscure their natural script. "Leave this house before sundown, or his life will be forfeit." It was signed by no name, and the ink, now faded to a peculiar brown, had bled slightly into the fibres of the paper, as though it had been hastily written with a blunt pen. "This was delivered to Miss Winslow on the afternoon of Sir Hubert's death," said Statham. "She presented it to the police when they arrived, but they dismissed it as a cruel jest, unconnected to the crime itself." Holmes's brows arched slightly. "The police, in their infinite wisdom, discarded a warning delivered within hours of a man's death, addressed to the very woman they accuse, and written in ink of singular and exotic composition." He gave a low chuckle. "It is a miracle Scotland Yard solves as much as the theft of a chicken. But what purpose could such a note serve?" I asked. "If it was meant to frighten her away, why issue the warning at all?" "A capital question, Watson," said Holmes. "The answer, I suspect, lies in the mind of its author, a mind which, I begin to perceive, is capable of both intricate cunning and considerable cruelty. A warning that foretells death does not prevent it, but rather implicates the warned party in the crime itself. Do you not see? It is the machinery of misdirection, nothing more." Statham leaned forward. "Then you believe Miss Winslow is innocent?" "Of that, my dear sir, I have not yet the slightest proof," Holmes said. "But the hand that penned this letter is of greater interest to me than the hand that poured the poison, for I rather fancy they are not the same." Holmes held the letter up to the lamplight, turning it this way and that, the pale glow illuminating the subtle stains and irregularities. "This ink," he murmured, "is no ordinary concoction. It has been thinned. See how the pigment bleeds unevenly, and its tint is unmistakable to anyone familiar with the dyes exported from the northern coast of South America." "South America?" I echoed. "Indeed," Holmes replied. "In particular, a certain indigo-producing house in British Guiana, a house whose name I shall reserve for the present. The handwriting, too, is worth our attention. It has been deliberately distorted, but the pressure of the pen, the strength of certain downward strokes, betrays the hand of a man accustomed to writing in Spanish, not English." "But what can it mean?" I asked. "It means," said Holmes, "that this case has its origins not in London, but in a place where justice and vengeance are often separated by a razor's edge, and where debts, once incurred, are not easily forgotten." Statham clasped his hands tightly together, his knuckles white with tension. "Mr. Holmes, I beg you, whatever suspicions you entertain, I implore you to act swiftly. Miss Winslow's trial is but days away, and should you fail to uncover the truth before the jury delivers its verdict, I fear she will be lost entirely." Holmes rose and paced to the window, gazing out at the rain-swept street below. His hands were thrust deep into the pockets of his dressing gown, and I could see the subtle flexing of his fingers, always a sign that his mind was racing through a dozen possibilities at once. "Fear not, Mr. Statham," he said at last. "You have placed your faith in my hands, and I shall not see it squandered. Watson, I believe the time has come for us to leave the comforts of Baker Street and reacquaint ourselves with the peculiar atmosphere of a house where death has recently visited." Without another word, Holmes reached for his coat, and within minutes we were stepping into the swirling gloom of a London night, bound for the sinister heart of the matter, the home of the late Sir Hubert Fawley. Our journey to Fawley Manor took us through the southwestern reaches of London, where the fields and lanes still bore the marks of recent rain. The air was thick with mist, and the carriage wheels sloshed through pools of water left by the passing storm. Holmes, silent for much of the ride, sat with his chin upon his chest, fingers pressed together in a steeple before him, his mind no doubt sifting through the slender strands of evidence we had thus far gathered. As we approached the estate, I could not suppress a shiver. The house was a gaunt, ivy-smothered edifice, its windows dark and its chimneys cold against the slate sky. There was a stillness about the place, a silence too deliberate to be natural, as if the very walls were holding their breath in dread anticipation. Holmes descended first, his sharp gaze sweeping the grounds with the thoroughness of a surveyor, though his hands remained casually in his pockets. A maid admitted us, a girl scarcely older than 20, whose eyes darted nervously from one of us to the other, as though uncertain whether we were saviours or villains. "I should like to speak with Mrs. Hargreaves," Holmes said quietly. "But first, Dr. Watson and I will examine the study." The girl hesitated for the briefest of moments, then nodded mutely, leading us down a dim corridor lined with heavy portraits of grim-faced men whose eyes seemed to follow us. The atmosphere grew heavier with each step, until at last we reached the door to Sir Hubert's study, a door that even now seemed to wear the shadow of its former occupant like a mourning veil. The study was a small, cluttered chamber, its walls lined with maps, medals, and mementos from Sir Hubert's colonial service. Holmes stepped across the threshold, with the quiet reverence of a priest entering a sanctuary, his eyes flicking from one detail to the next with swift and silent precision. The first object of his attention was the writing desk, its surface marred by a dark stain where the glass of port had toppled. Holmes bent low, his nose scarcely an inch above the wood, sniffing delicately before dipping a finger into the dried residue and tasting it with a grimace. "Port," he murmured, but laced with something far less convivial. He moved to the window next, where the brass telescope stood oddly askew upon the sill. Holmes adjusted its angle, peering through it with a slight smile. "Ah, Watson, observe how it faces the front gate, as though our late Sir Hubert had a particular interest in who came and went. A man who watches his gate so closely is either very lonely or very afraid." Finally, Holmes knelt by the hearth, where the faint scent of burnt paper lingered. From the ashes, his slender fingers extracted a few half-charred fragments. "A letter, I should imagine," he said, holding up the blackened scraps. "See here, Watson, part of a signature, though the ink has been almost entirely consumed. If I am not mistaken, we shall find these ashes bear the same unusual pigment as the letter shown to us by Mr. Statham." "Then Sir Hubert received a warning as well?" I asked. "It is one possibility," Holmes said, "though I fancy Sir Hubert's correspondent may have been of a far more familiar nature." He rose abruptly. "Come, Watson, let us see what Mrs. Hargreaves can tell us, if indeed she chooses to tell us anything at all." We found Mrs. Hargreaves in the servants' hall, a thin and severe woman whose hands were chafed red from years of scrubbing floors and polishing brass. She stood as we entered, her eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of Holmes, whom she seemed to recognize at once, though she offered no greeting. "Mrs. Hargreaves," Holmes said smoothly, "you were present on the night of Sir Hubert's death, were you not?" "I was, sir," she replied, her voice flat and guarded. "And you were the first to discover the body?" "No, sir," she said. "That was Miss Winslow. I found her in the study, standing over him, pale as a ghost, and trembling fit to fall." "How curious," said Holmes. "And yet it was you, I believe, who told the constable that you had seen Miss Winslow enter the study well before the hour of Sir Hubert's death. You saw her searching the desk, I think." Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. I saw her," she admitted. "She was rifling through the drawers, as if looking for something, papers maybe, but I thought nothing of it at the time." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening. "And did you, by chance, see anyone else that evening? Any stranger upon the grounds?" She shook her head quickly. Too quickly. "No, sir. No one." "Mrs. Hargreaves," said Holmes softly, "you are not a woman easily frightened, and yet you are frightened now. I wonder, who was it that told you to say nothing of the man seen near the orchard gate that very night?" Her mouth opened, then closed again, her hands wringing her apron so fiercely that the fabric twisted into knots. I don't know what you mean, sir." Holmes straightened. "You need not answer now, Mrs. Hargreaves, but rest assured, before this matter is concluded, the truth, every sordid inch of it, will come to light." From Mrs. Hargreaves, we were directed to the gardens, where the soil was still slick beneath our boots, and the hedgerows sagged beneath the weight of the evening rain. It was there we found Thomas Gill, the gardener, a man of stooped posture and weathered features, whose cap never left his head, and whose hands bore the ingrained dirt of a lifetime spent in the service of other men's earth. It was there we found Thomas Gill, the gardener, a man of stooped posture and weathered features, whose cap never left his head, and whose hands bore the ingrained dirt of a lifetime spent in the service of other men's earth. Holmes wasted no time with preamble. "Mr. Gill, you were here on the night Sir Hubert died." "I was, sir," the man answered, his voice gruff and uneven. "Took my tea in the tool shed after sundown, and was in my bed before 10. Holmes's gaze rested upon him for a moment, unblinking. "And yet, I am given to understand that you were seen not far from the orchard gate shortly after dark. I wonder, did you by chance see anyone else about the grounds that night?" The man shifted his weight, his hands knotting together in his lap. "I might have seen someone," he muttered, his eyes fixed firmly on the soil. "Just a shape, mind. Someone standing by the hedge, watching the house." "A shape, Mr. Gill?" Holmes pressed gently. "Man or woman?" "A man, I reckon," Gill said. "Tall and narrow, wrapped in a long coat. Stood still as a gravestone when I passed him. Gave me the shivers, if I'm honest." "And this mysterious figure," Holmes continued, "did you see his face?" "No, sir. He slipped away into the dark soon as he saw me looking. I thought no more of it till I heard about the master." Holmes gave a slight nod. "Thank you, Mr. Gill. You have been more helpful than you know." We left the gardener to his work, and as we returned to the house, I noted the deep furrow in Holmes's brow, a sure sign that some piece of the puzzle had just fallen, silently, into place. Our interview with Miss Winslow took place in a narrow upstairs parlour, where the poor girl sat pale and trembling, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that the knuckles shone white against her skin. She was a woman of delicate features and modest dress, her bearing that of one who had lived too long in the shadow of fear. Holmes began gently. "Miss Winslow, I would not ask you to relive painful memories unnecessarily, but I must understand the nature of your relationship with Sir Hubert. Was it cordial?" Her lips trembled before she answered. "He was cruel, Mr. Holmes, unbearably so. There was no kindness in him, no mercy. He delighted in finding fault, and his punishments were swift and often senseless." I saw Holmes's fingers drum softly against his knee. "And yet you remained in his service." "What choice had I?" she said faintly. "I had nowhere else to go." "There was no quarrel between you on the day of his death." She shook her head. "He hardly spoke to me at all. He was quiet, unnaturally so. It unnerved me more than his anger ever did." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And the letter, the warning you received?" "I found it slipped under my door that morning," she said. "I thought at first it was some cruel jest, but when Sir Hubert fell dead, I knew it was something far worse." Her voice faltered, and Holmes rose, offering a slight bow. "Thank you, Miss Winslow. That will suffice for the present." As we descended the stairs, I could not help but remark, "Her innocence seems genuine enough." "Perhaps," Holmes said, "but sincerity and truth are not always synonymous. Back in the study, Holmes stood with his back to the fireplace, hands clasped behind him, his gaze sweeping once more over the room. I knew that expression well, the deep inward focus of a man assembling the fragments of some intricate mosaic, each piece essential, no matter how small. "You observed, Watson," he began, "the telescope at the window." "Yes," I said. "It was pointed directly at the gate." "Precisely. A man with nothing to fear does not keep such vigilant watch upon his threshold." "And the burnt paper in the hearth, what did you make of it?" "A discarded letter, no doubt." "Very good. And the ink, as you saw, bore the same peculiar hue as the note Miss Winslow received. The hand that penned one, I dare say, penned both. And yet—" He paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "And yet?" I prompted. "And yet," Holmes said softly, "the warning was delivered to Miss Winslow. Why warn her unless the intention was to implicate her? It is a curious contradiction, is it not?" I frowned. "You mean—" "I mean," said Holmes, "that someone went to considerable lengths to ensure that Miss Winslow would stand accused. Someone who knew that the truth would lie not in the evidence left behind, but in the evidence deliberately destroyed." I opened my mouth to reply, but Holmes raised a finger. "No further conclusions just yet, my dear Watson. The path we follow is steep and uncertain, and I have no wish to stumble before we glimpse its end." There was nothing more to be said. The house, silent and brooding, seemed to watch us as we stood there, and I could not shake the growing sense that we had only begun to scratch the surface of something far darker than simple murder. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street that evening in silence. Though my friend's expression betrayed little of his thoughts, I knew that behind those keen, steel-grey eyes, the machinery of his mind was in relentless motion. It was not until we were seated once more before our familiar hearth, with the lamps trimmed low and a thin trail of smoke curling from his pipe, that he spoke. "Watson, have you ever heard of the Massera affair?" he asked abruptly. I confessed my ignorance. "It was a minor diplomatic scandal some 20 years ago," he continued. "Sir Hubert Fawley, then a junior officer stationed in British Guiana, was involved in the arrest and execution of a local man, a merchant by the name of Luis Massera, on charges of inciting rebellion. The evidence was flimsy at best, but Sir Hubert, ambitious and eager to impress his superiors, pressed for the man's death. The execution went ahead, and the incident was swiftly buried beneath the weight of colonial bureaucracy." Holmes leaned back, tapping his fingers against the arm of his chair. "It was said at the time that Massera had a son, a boy of 12 who witnessed his father's arrest. The boy vanished shortly afterwards, and no official record of his fate exists." "You believe this son may have returned to seek revenge?" I asked. Holmes's smile was faint. "There are few passions as enduring as the thirst for vengeance, Watson. Consider. Sir Hubert dies by poison derived from a rare Amazonian root. A letter written in South American ink warns Miss Winslow, and now the housekeeper trembles at the very mention of a shadowed stranger upon the grounds. Are we not beginning to glimpse the shape of our adversary?" "But why implicate Miss Winslow?" I objected. "That," said Holmes, "is a question that interests me more than all the others combined." It was shortly after breakfast the next morning when a telegram arrived from the local constabulary. Holmes read it once, his expression unchanging, and then passed it silently across the table to me. "Gardener Gill found dead in pond at dawn. Suspicious circumstances. Police request your presence." "Come, Watson," Holmes said, rising at once. "Our adversary moves faster than I had hoped. It seems Mr. Gill has paid the ultimate price for whatever secret he dared to share with us." We returned to Fawley Manor with all haste. The pond lay at the rear of the grounds, a stagnant pool choked with algae and fallen leaves. The body had already been dragged to the bank, where it lay shrouded beneath a sheet. Holmes knelt beside it, pulling back the covering with delicate fingers. Thomas Gill's face was slack and pale, his eyes wide with the terror of his final moments. Holmes conducted his examination with methodical care, peeling back the dead man's sleeves to expose his forearms. "Observe, Watson," he said. "Scratches, deep and irregular, along the wrists and hands. A sign, I would suggest, that our unfortunate gardener grasped desperately at the edge of the bank as he was forced beneath the water." I shuddered at the thought. He was murdered then, beyond question. But here... Holmes leaned closer, sniffing lightly at the skin. "Do you detect it? That faint, cloying scent?" I bent low, and indeed there was a lingering trace, something sweet, almost floral, but with a sharp, unfamiliar note beneath it. "Tropical oil," said Holmes. "One used to preserve certain medicinal plants in transit. It is, I believe, the same oil which stained the warning letter and perfumed the air of Sir Hubert's study. Our invisible adversary is less careful than he imagines." "But why kill the gardener?" I asked. "Surely he knew nothing of consequence." "On the contrary," Holmes said quietly, "he knew too much. He had seen the face that haunted the orchard gate, and for that knowledge, he was silenced. He stood, brushing his hands together with finality. The hand that pulled Sir Hubert's glass from his lips is the same hand that dragged poor Gill beneath these waters. We are not dealing with an amateur, Watson. This is a mind sharpened by long years of hatred and patience." We returned to Baker Street later that day, the autumn gloom deepening into dusk as Holmes once again retreated into his chemical sanctum. The warning note, already delicate from its rough handling, lay under the merciless scrutiny of Holmes's various reagents and lenses, subjected to tests whose purposes I could scarcely guess. "You see, Watson," he remarked, without turning from his work, "when the ordinary observer reads a note such as this, his attention is fixed upon the words themselves, upon the threat or the plea they convey. But to a man who understands the nature of ink and fibre, the very medium becomes the message." He held the paper to the light, turning it slowly. "Observe the slight yellowing along the edges. This ink, though appearing black at first glance, is in fact rich with traces of indigo, a peculiar dye extracted from a species cultivated almost exclusively along the Essequibo River. It is notoriously unstable, prone to breaking down when exposed to damp English air, leaving this faint ochre tint behind." "South American, then?" I asked. "Unquestionably, but the matter grows more intriguing still." He produced a small ledger from his desk. "This," he continued, "is the trade register for a firm known as Carmichael and Rojas, which once imported pigments and medicinal tinctures from British Guiana. You will find, if you consult the records, that they ceased trading some 6 years ago after their chief agent, one Luis Escobar, vanished following a particularly unfortunate disagreement with his employers." "Escobar!" I exclaimed. "You believe—" "I believe," said Holmes, "that our shadowed visitor at Fawley Manor and the vanished Luis Escobar are one and the same. You will note, Watson, that the ink which wrote the letter is precisely the ink Escobar's firm imported exclusively. Our adversary leaves his signature not at the bottom of the page, but in the very colour of his ink." The brilliance of the deduction struck me silent. Holmes had reached, through the barest chemical traces, into the very history of a man now reduced to a phantom. Yet, even in his triumph, my friend's expression remained guarded, as though some element of the puzzle still defied his grasp. "Come, Watson," he said at last. "Let us pay another visit to Mrs. Hargreaves. I have a suspicion that her memory may be more flexible than her conscience." The hour was late when we returned to Fawley Manor, and Mrs. Hargreaves received us with visible reluctance. Her hands, folded neatly before her, gripped the fabric of her apron until the knuckles shone white. Holmes took a seat by the fire, fixing her with that quiet and unyielding gaze which I had seen wear down even the most hardened liars. "Mrs. Hargreaves," he began softly, "I should like you to recount once more what you saw on the evening of Sir Hubert's death. In particular, I wish to hear again your statement concerning Miss Winslow's movements." The housekeeper swallowed hard. "I saw her, sir," she said. "I saw Miss Winslow enter the study not long after dinner. She was rifling through the desk, searching for something, though I cannot say what. When I passed again some time later, the room was dark and silent. That is all." "Indeed?" Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And you were entirely alone when you witnessed this?" "Yes, sir." Holmes's smile was faint and fleeting. "Curious, for it seems to me, Mrs. Hargreaves, that the gardener, Thomas Gill, mentioned seeing you that same evening standing near the orchard gate, some considerable distance from the study window." She stiffened. "I don't remember that, sir." "Memory is a fragile thing," said Holmes. "It bends to fit our fears." Her hands trembled now. "What do you want from me?" "Only the truth," Holmes said gently. "The whole truth. For I think, Mrs. Hargreaves, that you saw far more than you have admitted. I believe you saw someone else enter that study, and that whoever they were, they made it very clear you were to remain silent." Her resolve broke with a sob. I was afraid," she whispered. "He warned me, said no harm would come to me if I kept my mouth shut. I never meant to lie. I swear it." Holmes rose. "That, Mrs. Hargreaves, is the first honest word you have spoken to me. You have been very helpful, more helpful perhaps than you know." As we left the room, Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. The shape of the truth was growing sharper by the moment. As we travelled back from Fawley Manor, the weight of the case settled heavily upon me. Every scrap of evidence, every witness account, and every whisper of motive seemed to point inexorably toward Miss Clara Winslow. The poison, the note, even the housekeeper's reluctant admission, all converged upon her slender figure with the inevitability of a closing trap. "Holmes," I said at last, "I cannot fathom why you resist the obvious conclusion." Holmes, who had been gazing out the window, offered no reply. "Consider it," I pressed on. "Miss Winslow was found at the scene. She had ample motive, years of torment at Sir Hubert's hands. The very warning note you found so fascinating was addressed to her directly, and who else could have slipped it beneath her door? Even Mrs. Hargreaves, reluctant though she was, placed her at the study desk on the night of the murder. It is all but a confession." Holmes turned slightly, his expression placid. "And yet, my dear Watson," he said softly, "there is one element you neglect." "And what is that?" "Convenience," he replied. "You see, the case is altogether too convenient. Each piece of evidence presents itself as though laid upon a table for our inspection. And in my experience, Watson, the truth rarely reveals itself so obligingly." "But if not Miss Winslow, then who?" I demanded. "You speak of convenience, but have we any tangible alternative?" "Perhaps we do," Holmes said. "Or perhaps we merely have the shadow of one. I confess, Watson, that this puzzle possesses a shape most irregular, and I am seldom comfortable with irregular shapes." His refusal to explain further left me frustrated, yet I could not deny the confidence in his tone. Holmes had some unseen thread in his grasp, and though I could not yet discern its length or destination, I knew he would follow it to the bitter end. Holmes remained uncharacteristically quiet for much of the evening, smoking furiously as the rain beat upon the windows. His violin, usually a companion to his most complex meditations, lay untouched in its case. Each time I ventured a question, he waved me off with a gentle but resolute gesture, as though speech itself might disturb the delicate equilibrium of his thoughts. It was nearly midnight when he finally broke his silence. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the telescope upon Sir Hubert's window?" "Of course," I replied. "It was trained upon the gate." "Precisely. Now consider this. Why should a man of Sir Hubert's character, arrogant, cruel, unrepentant, maintain such relentless watch over his own front door? A man who fears no one has no need to guard his threshold." "You believe he feared someone?" "I am certain of it," said Holmes. "And I believe the letter which warned Miss Winslow was not meant for her at all, but for Sir Hubert himself. Its delivery into Miss Winslow's hands was no accident, but a deliberate manoeuvre designed to place her squarely within the noose. Then the author of the note is the same hand that poured the poison, Holmes concluded. "This hand does not belong to Miss Winslow. It belongs to a man whose hatred has simmered for 2 decades, a man whose identity I have begun to suspect, though I dare not yet speak his name aloud." "Why not?" I asked. "Because, my dear Watson, to accuse a ghost is no small matter, and until I can prove that the dead walk again, I would rather keep my suspicions to myself." He smiled faintly, though there was no humour in it. "For now, let us sleep, if sleep is possible with so many phantoms at our door." I retired to my room, but rest eluded me. Holmes's words echoed in my mind long after the lamps were dimmed. Somewhere, beneath the orderly layers of evidence and testimony, lay something deeper, a secret Holmes had glimpsed but not yet seized. It was a rare thing indeed to see Sherlock Holmes unsure of the shape his quarry took, and rarer still to see him troubled by it. I could not know then that the answer lay not in the study, nor the garden, nor even in Fawley Manor itself, but in the long, blood-stained shadow cast by British Guiana, and by the dead man whose hand had never truly let go of Sir Hubert's throat. It was just past 9 when Holmes informed me that we would not be spending the evening at Baker Street. He had said little throughout dinner, his mind plainly occupied by some intricate train of thought, and it was not until I had settled into my chair with my pipe that he abruptly rose and reached for his coat. "Come, Watson," said he, "there is a man in Limehouse I wish you to meet, and it would be most imprudent to keep him waiting." "Limehouse?" I repeated, startled by the suddenness of the announcement. "What business have we in so disreputable a quarter at this hour?" "Our business, my dear fellow," he said with the faintest smile, "is with the past. A past long buried, but one which, I fear, has found its way to our doorstep." The hansom cab carried us eastward, leaving behind the wide streets of the West End and plunging into the labyrinthine alleys that clustered along the river. The air was thick with coal smoke, the reek of brine, and the scent of a city whose shadows hid both commerce and crime in equal measure. Holmes said little as we travelled, save for one brief utterance. "You may wish to keep your revolver close at hand, Watson. Our host tonight is not one whose good faith I would readily trust." We alighted outside a narrow, weather-beaten tavern whose door hung slightly ajar, its hinges creaking with each gust of wind from the river. Holmes led the way inside, his stride confident, but his eyes watchful, and I followed with some trepidation. The air within was sour with stale beer and unwashed bodies, and from the gloom at the far end of the room a figure rose to greet us. A man whose face, I noted at once, was both utterly unfamiliar and yet possessed of a certain tragic familiarity. "Mr. Holmes," said the man, his voice low and measured, "you are punctual. I appreciate that." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Luis Escobar, I presume." There was a moment's silence after Holmes spoke the name, during which the man's lips tightened, as though the word itself caused him pain. He was a man of middle height, his frame wiry but hardened, his face tanned by sun and scarred by hardship. Though his speech was fluent, there was a faint trace of accent, the soft lilt of a South American tongue, overlaid upon careful English. "You know my name," said he. "That saves us both some time." Holmes gestured toward a small stained table in the corner, and the 3 of us seated ourselves. I observed Escobar closely, noting the way his hands trembled faintly as he struck a match to light his cigarette. Not the tremor of fear, but of long suppressed anger. "I knew it would come to this," said Escobar quietly. "I have seen your name in the papers, Mr. Holmes. A man who solves impossible puzzles. But tell me, what brought you to me? Was it the ink?" "Among other things," said Holmes. "Your ink was your signature, Mr. Escobar, a distinctive pigment once traded by Carmichael and Rojas, imported exclusively to Britain through your father's hands, until Sir Hubert Fawley had him hanged." Escobar's jaw clenched, and for a moment he said nothing. "I was 12 years old," he said at last, his voice scarcely more than a whisper. "I saw my father dragged from our house, beaten, humiliated, and when they hanged him, they made me watch. Sir Hubert stood beside me and said I would remember that day all my life. Holmes steepled his fingers. And so you did. Escobar's eyes flashed. I followed him to England. I worked in the docks, in the factories, anywhere his kind would not look. I waited for the right moment, the perfect chance to deliver justice as it was denied to my father. And so, said Holmes softly, you poisoned him. I did, said Escobar, with no trace of regret. The poison was one my father knew well, drawn from the curare vine deep in the Amazon, the same vine that grew near our village. One drop in his glass, and his own body became the noose around his neck. There was no bravado in his tone, no triumph, only the quiet, remorseless certainty of a man who had carried a single purpose across 2 decades and an ocean. Holmes leaned back, his expression unreadable. You had every reason to hate him, he said. But why the warning to Miss Winslow? Why involve her at all? Escobar's face darkened. Because Fawley's sins did not end in Guyana. I watched him in England, saw how he tormented that poor girl. I knew if I could place the blame at her feet, the world would be only too eager to believe it. Men like Fawley, they leave ruin in their wake. Ruin for the women they torment, the servants they break, the families they destroy. Miss Winslow was already ruined, in the eyes of the law, simply because she was poor and under his roof. And the note? Holmes asked. A precaution, said Escobar. I wanted her to leave the house, not to save Fawley, but to save herself. I hoped she would flee, and that her flight would make her look all the guiltier. I never imagined she would stay. Loyalty is a rare thing among the oppressed. I could not help but interject. You played with her life as though it were a mere pawn in your game of revenge. Escobar's gaze turned to me. I did what men like Fawley taught me to do. Injustice breeds only injustice, Doctor. If I have blackened my soul, it was his hand that first plunged it into the tar. Holmes exhaled softly. You calculated every move with precision, Mr. Escobar. There is only one element you misjudged. And what is that? My presence in the matter, Holmes said. You see, the truth has a habit of surfacing, even when buried beneath the weight of years and oceans. Escobar's eyes narrowed. So, you have me. Will you hand me to the police? Holmes was silent for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the tavern window, where the oily waters of the Thames caught the flickering lantern light. The night is still young, Mr. Escobar, he said at last. What happens next? Well, that will depend upon you. Holmes lit a cigarette with deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving Escobar's face. There is one element of your plan which interests me above all others, Mr. Escobar. Why involve Miss Winslow at all? Surely you, a man of some intelligence, could have achieved your revenge without the necessity of an innocent scapegoat. Escobar leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his expression curiously devoid of guilt. Innocent, you say? Perhaps in the matter of Sir Hubert's death, yes, but innocent in life. I wonder. Miss Winslow was not simply his companion, Mr. Holmes. She was his victim. I had watched them both for months, saw the way he ground her spirit beneath his heel. She was his creature, bound by fear, too cowed to raise her voice. And that, you see, made her perfect. Perfect, I echoed in disbelief. A perfect distraction, Escobar said. Who better to take the blame than the woman no one would think to defend? She was already guilty, in the eyes of society, merely by sharing his roof. And should the case ever come to trial, the jury would see only what they expected to see, a woman driven to the edge by cruelty, finally seizing her chance at freedom. You used her, I said bitterly, a pawn in your personal war. I used the tools that were placed before me, Escobar said calmly. Just as Sir Hubert once used the power of the Empire to destroy my father. I learned from the best, Doctor. Watson. Holmes exhaled softly. And you were content to let her hang. I was content to let justice find its natural course, Escobar said. If the law is blind, Mr. Holmes, who am I to correct its vision? There was no bravado in his tone, only the cold fatalism of a man who had long since made peace with the darkness inside him. It was Holmes, not Escobar, who finally broke the silence. You have played a dangerous game, Mr. Escobar, one that is not yet finished. There are moments, rare and terrible, when one sees Sherlock Holmes not merely as the brilliant logician or the master of deduction, but as a man burdened by the weight of knowledge, too complex for simple judgment. I saw that man in Holmes now, as he sat across from Escobar, the silence between them vibrating like a stretched wire. You understand, Holmes said quietly, that I could summon the police at this moment. A single word, and you would hang for the murder of Sir Hubert Fawley, regardless of the justification you place upon it. Escobar shrugged. Perhaps. But if justice exists, Mr. Holmes, it will not come from your Scotland Yard. Holmes drummed his fingers against the table. You planned this carefully, almost perfectly. But perfection, you see, is its own undoing. A perfect crime is no crime at all. It is a performance, and every performance requires an audience. I was never meant to see this play, Mr. Escobar. That is your only mistake. Escobar's gaze held no fear. And yet you are here, and the curtain is drawn. What will you do, Mr. Holmes? Holmes rose, smoothing his coat with a gesture I had seen 100 times before. There will be no curtain call tonight, he said. You will walk out of this tavern, Mr. Escobar. You will disappear into the fog, and if you are wise, you will disappear forever. I sprang to my feet, unable to contain my astonishment. Holmes, you cannot mean to let him go. The man is a murderer, a self-confessed poisoner. Holmes' gaze swept briefly to me. A murderer, yes, but not a villain. The law will not serve us here, Watson. This is justice of a different kind. I stood speechless as Escobar rose, inclining his head toward Holmes with the grave politeness of a man acknowledging a worthy opponent. Without another word, he slipped out into the night, the fog swallowing him whole. Holmes lit another cigarette, his face unreadable. Come, Watson, he said softly. Our work here is done, though I suspect you will not approve of its conclusion. We walked back through the dripping streets, the silence between us as heavy as the fog itself. My mind swirled with protest, with every instinct that had been drilled into me as a man of medicine and law. Holmes's actions defied reason, defied morality, defied everything I believed his code to represent. At last, unable to contain myself, I spoke. Holmes, you have allowed a confessed killer to walk free. How can you justify it? Holmes paused beneath a gas lamp, the glow catching in his sharp eyes. Justice, my dear Watson, does not always wear the face of the law. There are crimes so old, so deeply rooted in wrong, that no verdict can cleanse them. The rope would not balance the scales. It would only perpetuate the weight of blood upon blood. But surely, I said, our duty is to the law. We are not judges, Holmes. We are men of reason. And reason, Watson, tells me that what Escobar took was not life, but payment long overdue. Sir Hubert Fawley's death was written 20 years ago, the moment he seized that boy's father and fed him to the gallows. If you believe that could end in any other way, you understand the world far less than I had hoped. I fell silent, the certainty of my own moral compass shaken to its core. Holmes, sensing my disquiet, clapped a hand upon my shoulder, not in triumph, but in gentle reassurance. You and I, Watson, walk a peculiar road, one where the light of the law does not always reach. There are times we must be the light ourselves, even if the glow is imperfect. We reached Baker Street before dawn, and Holmes, settling into his armchair, lit his pipe with a hand as steady as ever. The case was over, and yet the sense of resolution eluded me. There had been no arrest, no trial, no satisfying closure. only silence, and the faint echo of footsteps vanishing into the fog. Holmes exhaled a thin stream of smoke, his gaze distant. "There is a higher law, Watson," he said at last. "A law beyond courts and juries. Tonight, I have obeyed it." And with that, the great detective fell silent, leaving me alone with my thoughts, and the uneasy knowledge that justice, in this case, had worn no badge but that of a long, bitter memory. The following evening found Holmes and me once more ensconced at Baker Street, the fire crackling pleasantly in the grate while my companion sat in his accustomed chair, his long fingers steepled, and his gaze fixed upon some unseen point in the middle distance. His pipe, long extinguished, lay across his knee like a discarded thought. I had scarcely touched my supper, the events of Limehouse still gnawing at my sense of justice. At last, unable to bear the silence any longer, I said, "Holmes, I must have some explanation. The entire affair remains a fog in my mind." Holmes stirred, as though recalling himself from some great distance. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he began, "how the smallest detail can illuminate the whole. You will remember, upon our first visit to Fawley Manor, my interest in the burnt fragments within Sir Hubert's hearth. I recall it well. Those fragments were once a letter written by Luis Escobar. His first instinct, after slipping the poison into Sir Hubert's port, was to leave a direct warning. But some hesitation, some flash of inspiration, stayed his hand, and he destroyed it. In its place, he composed a second letter, the infamous note to Miss Winslow, calculated not to warn, but to implicate. "And the telescope?" I asked. "Ah," said Holmes, his eyes brightening slightly. "The telescope was our silent witness. It had been set not to observe the night sky, nor the distant woods, but the very gate through which Miss Winslow would return from her evening walk. Escobar, understanding the cruel mind of Sir Hubert, knew the colonel would keep watch over her movements, his suspicion heightened by his own guilt-ridden conscience. And the tropical oil? A trace left upon the letter, and, later, upon the skin of poor Thomas Gill. A relic of Escobar's days in the trade houses of Guiana. No Englishman would carry such a scent, nor would any London ink contain such pigment. The oil, the ink, and the burnt paper, each was a thread, Watson, and together they wove the whole tapestry. I confess that even with Holmes's methodical recital, my mind still struggled to grasp the cruel ingenuity of the scheme. "But how," I asked, "did Escobar ensure that Miss Winslow would be the first to discover the body?" "Simple," Holmes replied. "The telescope, trained upon the gate, allowed Sir Hubert to observe her return. When she entered the house, Escobar knew that Sir Hubert would summon her, whether to berate her, humiliate her, or some other petty cruelty known only to himself. And once she entered the study," I said slowly, "she found Sir Hubert already dead." "Precisely. Escobar had already administered the poison, timing it so that death would arrive shortly before her return. When the police arrived, the facts would arrange themselves with almost mechanical efficiency. Miss Winslow, found alone with the body, with motive aplenty and a conveniently suspicious letter addressed to her." I could not suppress a shudder. It was devilish. Holmes gave a faint smile. Ingenious, I would say. Had Escobar's hand been slightly steadier, had he taken care to cleanse the oil from his fingers or disposed of the telescope's curious alignment, the plan might have succeeded entirely. But why leave any letter at all? Because even the most patient of men cannot resist the urge to declare his work, Holmes said. In the end, it is always vanity that betrays the criminal. There remained, however, one element which had puzzled me since the beginning. And the gardener, poor Thomas Gill. Holmes's expression grew sombre. "A man in the wrong place at the wrong time," he said softly. "You will recall that Gill mentioned seeing a figure near the orchard gate." "Yes." "It was Escobar, gaining entry to the house under cover of darkness. Gill, thinking nothing of it at the time, mentioned the sight to Mrs. Hargreaves. That sealed his fate. But why kill him? Because Escobar, for all his precision, could not risk even the smallest witness. Once he knew Gil had seen him, the gardener's life was forfeit. He lured him to the pond, perhaps under some harmless pretext, and there forced him beneath the water until silence was assured. I shook my head, all to silence a man who had seen nothing more than a shadow. Guilt, said Holmes, is a strange and unpredictable thing. Escobar had spent 20 years mastering patience, but the moment his plan entered its final act, fear took him. Fear that one misplaced word, one idle recollection, might unravel his careful work. In the end, it was his fear, not his hatred, that proved fatal to poor Thomas Gil. And yet, I said, you let him go. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the window. Justice, Watson, he said quietly, is not always found in the hands of the law. The full account, laid out with Holmes's usual clarity, did little to quell the storm within me. In fact, it sharpened my sense of disbelief and frustration to a point I could no longer suppress. You had him, Holmes, I exclaimed. A self-confessed murderer, a man who poisoned in cold blood and drowned a harmless servant to cover his tracks. And yet you allowed him to slip away into the night, free to walk the streets as though innocent. Holmes, reclining in his chair, regarded me with the patient amusement one might afford an excitable child. Your indignation does you credit, Watson, though it is misplaced. Misplaced, I cried. The law exists for precisely this purpose, to punish the guilty and protect the innocent. If you of all men begin to take justice into your own hands, where does it end? Ah, said Holmes softly, but you mistake my purpose. I am no judge, no avenger, and certainly no executioner. I did not release Escobar because I sympathize with his crime, but because I understand its cause. And understanding, my dear Watson, is the very foundation of justice. Justice. This was vengeance, plain and simple. Perhaps, said Holmes, his gaze drifting to the darkened window. But the scales, I believe, are balanced at last. I shook my head, unwilling to accept such moral flexibility from the man I had so long held as the paragon of reason. Yet, in his calm detachment, there was a certainty I could not fully refute. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingertips meeting in that familiar attitude of thought. Consider, Watson, the machinery of the law. It is designed to punish the act, not the history that gave birth to it. What would the courts see if Escobar stood before them? A foreigner who murdered a respectable English gentleman. And what would they ignore? The slow, grinding cruelty that made that murder inevitable. The law cannot be expected to weigh sentiment, Holmes, I argued. It deals in facts. Facts, yes, said Holmes. But you and I, Watson, we deal in something far more elusive. We trace motives through the shadows, follow hatred through decades, and see the crimes that precede the crime. The law sees the death of Sir Hubert Fawley. I see the death of Louis Macera. Both are murders, but only one would hang. But if we allow sentiment to excuse crime, where does justice stand? Holmes smiled faintly. Justice, my dear fellow, often stands somewhere far from the dock. I could muster no reply, for in his words I saw the uncomfortable truth, that sometimes the law is too blunt an instrument to carve out the finer shapes of human wrong and consequence. In such cases, Holmes concluded, we are left to trust the judgment of a higher court, the court of conscience. And for that, Watson, there is no appeal. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing faintly in the grate, when Holmes reached for his pipe at last. The case was over, the deductions complete, and yet a curious silence lingered between us, a silence filled with unspoken doubts and unresolved truths. Holmes struck a match, the flame flaring briefly in the dimness, and for a moment his sharp features were thrown into relief, the profile of a man who had peered too long into the darker recesses of the human soul. There is a reason, Watson, he said softly, why I prefer deduction to judgment. And what is that? I asked. Because deduction requires only logic, he said. Judgment demands understanding, and understanding is far more difficult to come by. He drew thoughtfully upon his pipe, the smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling. I do not know, Watson, if I was right to let Escobar go, but I know that to condemn him would have been to ignore the hand that first wrote his story. In this case, justice and the law were never destined to meet. He stood, gazing out into the fog-cloaked night. There is a higher law, Watson, a law beyond courts and juries. Tonight, I have obeyed it. And with that, Sherlock Holmes turned from the window, leaving me alone with my thoughts, and the uneasy awareness that in the great detective's world, justice was never as simple as guilt and innocence. We sat in silence for some time after Holmes had delivered his final words, the dying embers casting flickering shadows across the room. Outside, the fog curled against the window pane, and in the distance, the bells of some unseen church tolled the hour. Yet even as the case reached its conclusion, a peculiar unease settled within me, a feeling that justice, for all Holmes's brilliance, had slipped through our fingers like the very fog outside. It was Holmes who broke the silence at last, his voice soft, but edged with that familiar tone of reflective finality. "You see, Watson," he said, "the true solution to this case lay not in discovering who administered the poison. That was elementary enough. The deeper mystery was this: who held the greater guilt? The man who struck the final blow, or the man who first set the wheel in motion decades before?" I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. "Are you saying that Sir Hubert's death was inevitable?" "Inevitable, perhaps," Holmes said, "but not excusable. Injustice, when left to fester, breeds only further injustice. One crime begets another, until at last the line between victim and villain dissolves entirely." He turned to me, his eyes sharp beneath the curling smoke of his pipe. "That is why, my dear Watson, I have always preferred the clarity of logic to the murk of morality. A deduction is either correct or incorrect, but justice is a far more slippery creature." He rose, pacing to the window, gazing out into the mist. "Some would say I have let a guilty man walk free tonight. Others might say that the law itself was guilty long before this night began. The question, Watson, is this: which do you believe?" He did not wait for my answer, nor did I expect him to. Holmes, in his infinite complexity, had left me, and now you, to decide the matter for ourselves. What do you believe was Luis Escobar's greatest mistake? Was it the tropical oil left on the gardener's skin, the misdirected telescope, or perhaps something deeper, a flaw not in his plan but in his heart? Share your deduction in the comments. Holmes and I are most curious to know whether your reasoning matches the great detective's own. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes cases where logic battles, deception, and justice is never quite what it seems. Like the story, share it with fellow mystery lovers and let us know. Would you have let Escobar walk free, or would you have handed him to the law? The game, dear reader, is always afoot.